The house was still when Daniel Hargrove stepped through the front door 3 days ahead of schedule. The Singapore deal had collapsed in the final hour, leaving him with nothing but a cancelled flight, rebooked on instinct, and an exhaustion so complete it had turned his bones to lead. He did not call ahead. He never called ahead. In 15 years of running Hargrove Capital, he had learned that the truest picture of any situation is always the one captured in a moment no one has prepared for. The foyer was dim, the chandelier set to its lowest warm glow, and the only sound in the grand Charleston house was the soft, patient ticking of the grandfather clock his mother had inherited from her own mother decades ago. He set his briefcase down on the marble entry table, loosened the knot of his tie, and moved toward the kitchen for a glass of water. He passed the hallway. He stopped. The door to his mother's room, the door that was always kept half closed per the nurse's strict instruction, was open, and from within it came a light that was warm and low, the kind that a bedside lamp throws when someone has turned it to its softest setting on purpose, with care, with intention. He pushed the door the rest of the way open, and what he saw arrested him completely. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. His mother, Eleanor Hargrove, lay in her bed, her white hair splayed softly against the pillow, so her breathing deep, and even in a way it almost never was anymore. The way it sounded before the illness had taken hold and turned every night into a battlefield of restlessness. Her hand rested atop the quilt, and it was held, gently, firmly, by the hand of the woman sitting in the chair beside the bed, the maid. Elena Castillo sat with her dark head resting against the high back of the armchair, her eyes closed, her lips barely parted in sleep. She was still wearing her uniform, the simple pale gray dress that all the household staff wore, but her shoes had been removed and placed with great neatness beneath the chair. Her free hand rested in her lap, and on her face was an expression of such complete and unguarded peace that Daniel felt for a moment as if he had walked into a painting that had nothing to do with his actual life. When he stood there for a long moment, the anger rising in him slowly, the way water begins to heat. First a warmth, then a simmer, then a boil. She was asleep, in his mother's room, holding his mother's hand. Daniel crossed the room in 4 long strides. "What is the meaning of this?" he said, his voice low but loaded with the particular authority of a man who has never once in his professional life had to raise his voice to make people afraid. Elena's eyes opened. She did not gasp or scramble upright. She simply looked at him with a steadiness that he found immediately disarming and immediately irritating. A calm, dark gaze that assessed the situation in a single second and then offered no apology. "Mr. Hargrove," she said softly, releasing his mother's hand with great care, as though she were setting down something irreplaceable. You are not supposed to be in this room after 9 o'clock. That is Mrs. Lawson's standing instruction." His voice was flat and precise. "You are not a nurse. You are not family. This is not your place." Elena stood, moving to retrieve her shoes with quiet efficiency. "Your mother couldn't sleep," she said, her accent, faint traces of something Spanish lilted, worn smooth by years of navigating other people's households, giving her words a measured cadence that matched neither defiance nor submission. She was calling out, and there was no one on the floor. Mrs. Lawson had gone to get her medication from the pharmacy and left a note saying she would be back by 9:30. It was 9:45. "So you took it upon yourself to—" "I sat with her until she fell asleep," Elena said simply, her shoes now on her feet, her posture straight, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "That is all." Daniel looked at his mother. Eleanor was still sleeping, deeply, peacefully, in a way he had not witnessed in months. The slight furrow she usually wore between her brows, even in sleep, was gone. Her face was as smooth and untroubled as a child's. Something moved in his chest. He pushed it aside. "This won't happen again," he said. "If there is a gap in Mrs. Lawson's schedule, you notify me or call the service line. You do not improvise." He paused. "We will speak about this in the morning." Elena nodded once and moved toward the door. Then she stopped, turned back, and straightened the small glass of water on the bedside table, adjusting it so the straw angled precisely toward where his mother's lips would be when she woke. The gesture was so small and so deliberate that Daniel had no idea what to do with it. She left without another word. He stood alone in the room for a long moment, listening to the soft, even breath of his mother, feeling the peculiar silence that her sleeping face produced in him, a grief-adjacent feeling he had never found the right word for. To understand what that moment truly meant, you must understand both of them. Not the version of Daniel that the financial pages printed, the ice-blooded magnate who had tripled his father's portfolio in under a decade, and not the version of Elena that the household registry described. Castillo, Elena M., age 31, residential housekeeper, hired 6 months prior. Those versions are outlines of people. To understand what was happening in that room, then you must go back to where each of them began. Daniel Hargrove had grown up in this house, though in those years, the house had felt entirely different, warmer, louder, more forgiving of its own creaks and drafts. His mother, Eleanor, had been the kind of woman who named every plant in the garden and remembered the birthday of every person who had ever worked in her kitchen. His father, George Hargrove, had been a quieter force, reserved, precise, the kind of man whose love was communicated through provision rather than expression. When George died 8 years ago, something in Eleanor had begun a slow and imperceptible retreat, as though she had been holding herself open specifically for the man she had built her life around. And without him, the architecture of her spirit had begun to shift. The illness came 3 years after that. The doctors gave it a long clinical name that Daniel had memorized and then refused to say aloud, as though naming it regularly would give it more power than it already possessed. What it meant, in practical terms, was that his mother was leaving, not all at once, not like his father's Tuesday afternoon heart attack, but in pieces, day by day, like a mosaic being disassembled tile by tile, until one day there would be nothing but the outline of where a picture used to be. Daniel had responded to this the only way he knew how. He hired the best neurologist in South Carolina. He restructured his professional schedule so that he was never more than a 4-hour flight from home. He converted the east wing of the house into a fully equipped care suite. He hired Mrs. Lawson, a registered nurse with 20 years of memory care experience, so he hired rotating household staff to ensure that every physical comfort was consistently provided. What he had not done, what he could not bring himself to do, was simply sit beside her. Because every time he sat beside her, he had to confront the reality of what was leaving. And Daniel Hargrove had built an entire identity around never confronting things he could not fix. Elena Castillo had learned to sit beside people a long time ago. She was 6 years old the first time she sat through a night with someone who was sick. Her mother, Rosa, had come down with a fever so high it had turned the small apartment in Miami into a geography of anxiety. Cool cloths and shallow breathing, and the specific terror that exists only in children who understand, somehow, that the person they love most in the world might not always be there. Rosa had survived that fever, and many harder things after it. But Elena had never forgotten the particular texture of those vigil hours, the way time moved differently in them, the way silence took on a quality of its own, a presence, almost, that required tending. Rosa Castillo had worked in other people's houses for 40 years. She had done it with a dignity so ingrained it was structural. It held her upright through the worst of it, through the employers who spoke to her as though she were furniture, through the holidays spent cleaning strangers' dining rooms while her own daughter sat home alone with the television for company. She had given Elena 2 things, she always said: a work ethic that nothing could erode, and a capacity for noticing what other people needed before they knew they needed it themselves. Rosa had died 14 months ago, in the same small apartment, in the same city. Elena had held her hand through the entire final night. 2 weeks after the funeral, Elena packed a single suitcase for herself and a smaller one for her 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, and took a bus north to Charleston, where an employment agency had placed her with a household service matching domestic workers to private estates. The listing for the Hargrove position had specified, twice, that the candidate must possess exceptional discretion. Elena had read that word and recognized it. Discretion was the professional name for what her mother had always called the art of seeing without being seen. She had reported for her first day with her hair pinned back and her shoes resoled for the 3rd time, because Rosa had taught her that you always show up with clean shoes. The house was beautiful in the impersonal way that houses maintained by professional staff often are. Everything gleaming, everything placed with architectural precision, nothing suggesting the organic disorder of people actually living inside it. Mrs. Lawson had given her the schedule. Claudia Reyes, the household manager, had given her the supply lists and the cleaning rotation. And Daniel Hargrove, whom she met briefly on day 3, had given her a handshake and a gaze so brief it barely qualified as a glance. The kind of acknowledgement a man makes when he is performing the gesture of seeing someone without actually seeing them at all. None of that had unsettled her. She had been seen that way before. What had struck her, on that first afternoon, when Claudia walked her through the East Wing to explain which surfaces required which solutions, was the old woman in the room at the end of the hall. Eleanor Hargrove had been sitting in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze aimed somewhere beyond the garden and the magnolia trees and the low gray sky over the Cooper River. She wore a pale yellow cardigan that was buttoned unevenly, 3rd button in the 2nd hole, and on her face was an expression Elena recognized from the last year of her mother's life, the expression of a person whose interior world had become more real and more compelling than the external one. Elena had asked Claudia quietly whether anyone adjusted Mrs. Hargrove's buttons when they were uneven. Claudia had replied with mild impatience that Mrs. Lawson handled anything related to Mrs. Hargrove's person. Elena had nodded and said nothing more. But the following morning, cleaning the hallway outside Eleanor's room, she heard no nurse inside. She knocked softly, entered, and found the old woman in the same chair. Different cardigan, same problem. Elena set down her cleaning supplies, walked to the chair, and said in the quietest voice, "Good morning, Mrs. Hargrove. Would you mind if I fix this for you?" Eleanor looked at her, really looked at her, the gaze sharp and sudden in a way the illness hadn't yet claimed, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You have Rosa's eyes." Elena went very still. "I'm sorry," she said. Eleanor was already looking back toward the window, her voice dropping back into the distance it usually occupied. "Beautiful eyes," she murmured. "Just like her." Elena refastened the buttons with careful hands, wished the old woman a quiet good morning, and left the room. She stood in the hallway afterward, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Her mother's name was Rosa. She told herself it was coincidence. The illness distorted things, took fragments of the past, and surfaced them at random, like objects dislodged from the floor of a river. It meant nothing. But over the following weeks, Eleanor said it again, and again. Always the same words, spoken with the same quality of piercing recognition, always in the moments when she looked at Elena most directly. "You have Rosa's eyes." By the time Daniel Hargrove walked into his mother's room to find Elena asleep in the bedside chair, the name had been spoken 9 times. Elena had not yet told anyone, so the morning after Daniel's return began with the particular tension of a household that knows a confrontation is coming and has arranged itself accordingly. Claudia moved through the kitchen with studied efficiency. The part-time groundskeeper arrived early and found reasons to stay outside. And Elena made breakfast, not because it was in her rotation, but because she had learned that in charged atmospheres, the smell of something warm and ordinary has a quieting effect on people, and she wanted, above all else, for the morning not to go the way she suspected it might. She was transferring eggs to a serving dish when she heard heels on the marble floor, not the flat, purposeful stride of Daniel's morning walk, but the precise, elevated click of Renata Voss. Renata had been introduced to Elena during her 2nd week as Daniel's fiancée, a description Renata had offered herself, and Claudia had confirmed with minimal elaboration. She was a woman of 40, with the kind of face constructed for first impressions, strong, symmetrical, immediately memorable. Her manner revealed itself more slowly as something colder than it first appeared. She treated the household staff the way some people treat traffic, as an inconvenience to be navigated rather than acknowledged. She came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw Elena at the stove. "You should know," Renata said, setting her coffee cup down on the counter with a sharp click, "that what happened last night was completely unacceptable." Elena kept her back to her. "I understand. Mrs. Lawson has a protocol. The protocol exists for a reason. Eleanor is not a project for you to involve yourself with." Renata's voice carried the particular edge of someone making a point they have been waiting to make for a long time. "You clean the house. That is what you were hired to do. Anything beyond that is overstepping." Elena turned then, setting the serving dish on the counter and meeting Renata's eyes directly. "Mrs. Hargrove was alone and distressed," she said. "I stayed with her. I would do it again." The silence that followed had a quality, like the pause before thunder, that made the kitchen feel smaller. Renata opened her mouth, then closed it. She said, with a thinness that was its own kind of fury, "Daniel wants to see you in the study at 8. She walked out. Elena stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, breathing the way her mother had taught her to breathe when the world got loud. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady. She thought of Sophia, who was 7 years old and currently staying with their neighbor Mrs. Barton, who was kind, but not equipped for long-term arrangements. She thought of the medication Sophia took every morning for the condition she had been born with. The medication that cost what it cost and arrived every month with the reliability of a tide, dependent entirely on Elena's continued employment. She thought of her mother, who had cleaned other people's houses for 40 years and died in a rented room. She thought of Eleanor Hargrove, sitting alone in her chair, looking out at the garden with eyes that held a story no one in this house had ever bothered to ask about. Then she picked up the serving dish, then straightened her back and walked toward the dining room. She was not afraid of the study at 8 o'clock. She had survived harder rooms than that. The study was a room that smelled of old leather and the accumulated weight of the Hargrove family history. Dark wood bookshelves, a portrait of George Hargrove above the fireplace, the wide oak desk that Daniel had inherited, along with everything else, and had never once rearranged. He was already seated when Elena entered, his jacket on, his posture the precise geometry of a man who has decided something and is informing you of it rather than discussing it. Renata stood near the window, her coffee cup in hand, watching. "Sit down, please," Daniel said. Elena sat. He was quiet for a moment, and looking at her with the same brief analytical assessment he had given her on day 3. But this time, something in the assessment lingered. Something had shifted in the night. "What you did last evening was outside your scope of employment," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "Yes, sir." "Mrs. Lawson's protocols are not suggestions. They exist to protect my mother from disruption and unnecessary emotional stimulation." Elena said nothing. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "My question is simple. What were you doing in that room?" "I told you last night," Elena said, her voice measured. "Mrs. Hargrove was alone. She was frightened. I stayed with her. She calls out sometimes. Mrs. Lawson is aware of this. There are systems in place." "The systems were not in the room," Elena said quietly. "No, I was." Renata made a small sound from the window. Not quite a scoff, but close. Daniel studied Elena for a long moment. There was something in the way she met his gaze that unsettled the rehearsed efficiency of this conversation. Something that refused to reduce itself to the simple transaction of employer and employee, wrongdoing and consequence. "My mother said something to you," he said. It was not a question. Elena's hands, folded in her lap, did not move. But something in her eyes did, a brief, careful shift, like the adjustment of a lens. "She talks," Elena said. "She remembers things." "What things?" A pause, small but precise, measured like a dosage. "She mentions a name," Elena said. "She has mentioned it many times since I began working here." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "What name?" Elena looked at him steadily. "On Rosa," she said. The word landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, cleanly, with the immediate and unavoidable consequence of ripples moving outward in every direction. Daniel Hargrove didn't move, but the color left his face so completely and so quickly that Renata turned from the window to look at him, her coffee cup forgotten in her hand. And in the silence that followed, for the first time in 6 months, Elena Castillo understood that the name her mother had carried all her life, the name that had been spoken to her as a ghost, as a coincidence, as a fragment of an old woman's fading memory, was not a coincidence at all. The silence in the study lasted long enough to become something other than silence. It became a held breath, the kind the body takes before it braces for impact. So Daniel Hargrove did not speak for a full 30 seconds after Elena said the name. He sat behind his father's desk, with his hands flat on the surface, his jaw set, and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere just past Elena's shoulder, as though he were looking at something no one else in the room could see. Renata had set her coffee cup down. She stood very still by the window, watching her fiancé with an expression Elena could not entirely read. Not concern, exactly, but something close to alarm. The alarm of a person watching a door they believe to be locked begin to open on its own. "Where did you hear that name?" Daniel said at last. His voice had changed. The boardroom precision was still there, but beneath it was something raw, a roughness that did not belong to the man who had dismissed her calmly in his mother's room the night before. "From her," Elena said. "Only from her. She says it when she looks at me. She has said it since my second week in this house." Daniel stood up. He turned to the window, standing with his back to both women, his hands clasped behind him in a posture Elena recognized as the physical translation of a man trying to contain something that does not want to be contained. "That will be all for now," he said, his voice quiet and final. "You may return to your duties." Elena rose without a word and left the room. As she pulled the door closed behind her, she was certain she heard, Renata say something in a low, urgent voice, and Daniel's response in a single flat syllable that gave nothing away. She did not stop to listen. She walked down the corridor toward the east wing, moving with the measured calm she had cultivated over a lifetime of navigating spaces where she was not fully welcome. And she thought about her mother, Rosa. She had spoken the name every day of Elena's life, not with grief after a time, but with a kind of settled love, the love of a woman who has accepted that the person she was must not be defined by the place that rejected her. Rosa Castillo had told Elena very little about her years working in private houses before Elena was born. She had told her about the work itself, the rhythm of it, the discipline, the dignity that was possible if you carried it inside you rather than waiting for anyone to grant it to you. She had not told her about the specific houses, the specific families. She had said only once, in a quiet moment near the end of her life, that there had been a woman she loved very much, a woman who had been genuinely kind to her in a world that was mostly unkind. She had not said the woman's name. Elena had not thought to ask. Now, walking the long corridor of the Hargrove house with the smell of magnolia drifting through an open window, she felt the edges of something enormous pressing against the boundaries of what she understood about her own history. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She made her way to the east wing. Mrs. Lawson had arrived, her shoes visible beneath Eleanor's door, the soft murmur of the morning medication routine audible through the wood. Elena stood outside for a moment, then moved on to the small sitting room at the end of the hall, where she had cleaning to do. The sitting room adjoined Eleanor's bedroom through a narrow connecting door that was usually kept closed. Elena had cleaned this room 100 times. The bookcases, the writing desk, the small collection of framed photographs arranged on the credenza near the window. She had learned long ago not to linger over the photographs. Claudia had made clear in the first week that the family's personal effects were not the staff's business. A directive Elena respected with the professional instincts her mother had installed in her. But today she stopped. She set down her supplies and stood in front of the credenza, looking at the photographs with a different quality of attention than she had ever allowed herself before. There were pictures of Daniel at various ages, a school portrait, a graduation, the stiff formality of a family Christmas. There were pictures of George Hargrove, silver-haired and composed, shaking hands at what appeared to be a business function. There were pictures of Eleanor in younger decades, a radiant woman in a wide-brimmed garden hat, laughing at something outside the frame, her entire face lit from within. And then, at the end of the row, tucked slightly behind a larger frame, as though it had shifted there over time, and no one had thought to reposition it, there was a photograph Elena had never noticed before. It was small, the size of a postcard, and the color had taken on the amber warmth of age. Two women stood together in what appeared to be a garden. One was Eleanor, younger, wearing a sundress, her arm around the other woman's shoulders, with the ease of genuine affection. The other woman was shorter, darker-haired, laughing with her whole body, in the way that people laugh when they are completely unguarded and entirely happy. Elena picked up the photograph. Her hands were not entirely steady. The laughing woman in the picture wore a simple dress and a pair of small gold earrings, a pair Elena recognized because they were the same pair that now lived in a small velvet pouch in the inside pocket of her suitcase. The pair that Rosa Castillo had pressed into her daughter's palm on the last night of her life and said, without explanation, that Elena should keep them always. Elena stood in the sitting room of the Hargrove house, holding the photograph, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives not as a thought, but as a physical sensation in the center of the chest, that the woman laughing in that picture was her mother. She did not tell anyone what she had found. This was not deception. It was the same instinct that had kept her mother alive in difficult places for 40 years. The understanding that truth, revealed at the wrong moment to the wrong person, does not set you free. It simply changes the shape of the danger. Elena replaced the photograph precisely where she had found it, picked up her supplies, and finished cleaning the sitting room with the same methodical attention she brought to every surface, every corner, every task. But her mind was moving, fast and quiet, the way it had moved on the night her mother's breathing changed, and she had understood, without a doctor's confirmation, that there were only hours left. She needed to know what had happened. Not the fragments that Eleanor's illness surfaced at random, the ghost of a name, the recognition in an old woman's eyes, but the full and actual account of how Rosa Castillo and Eleanor Hargrove had known each other, and why that knowledge had been buried so thoroughly that Elena had lived 31 years without any trace of it. There was only one person who might be able to tell her. She waited until the afternoon, until Mrs. Lawson had gone to prepare the evening medication, and the house had settled into its quiet mid-afternoon pause. And then she knocked softly on Eleanor's door. "Come in," the old woman said, with a clarity that surprised Elena every time it arrived. The illness was not linear. It moved in tides, some hours taking nearly everything, others returning Eleanor to a sharpness that felt like a gift precisely because it was temporary. This was one of those hours. Eleanor was sitting in her chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the garden where the last of the autumn roses were holding on against the cooling air. She turned when Elena entered, and her face did the thing it always did. That immediate, piercing recognition, that quality of seeing something behind Elena's features that only she could access. "Sit with me," Eleanor said, gesturing to the small stool beside the chair. Elena sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The window held the light of the late afternoon in a way that turned everything gold, and the garden below was very still. "You found it," Eleanor said. Not a question. Elena looked at her. "The photograph. I moved it behind the other frame myself, 6 months ago, when I still remembered why." A pause. "I wanted someone to find it. I just couldn't remember who I was waiting for." Eleanor's eyes were bright and very clear. "And then you walked through that door on your second day, and I knew. You have her eyes exactly. The same shape. The same way of looking at a room as though you're deciding whether to trust it." Elena felt the tightening in her throat that she had not allowed herself in the study that morning. "Her name was Rosa," she said. "She was my mother." "I know," Eleanor said. I knew the moment I saw you." "She died 14 months ago." The old woman closed her eyes. For a long moment she was entirely still, and the quiet of the room was the kind of quiet that holds grief the way a vessel holds water, contained and heavy and full. "I am sorry," Eleanor said. "She was the best person I ever knew, and I failed her." Elena waited. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at the garden, and when she spoke, her voice had the quality of something long rehearsed, a testimony given finally, after years of waiting for the right witness. "Your mother came to work for us 33 years ago," she said. "She was 22. She had come up from Miami with almost nothing, and she was the most capable, the most warm, the most genuinely good person who had ever set foot in this house. We became friends, and that is not something that was done. A woman of my position, a friendship with the help. But Rosa made friendship the way some people make music, effortlessly, and without caring whether the audience approved. A small, aching smile. I loved her. Not as an employer loves a valued employee, as a person loves another person entirely." Elena held very still. "She worked here for 3 years," Eleanor continued, "and during that time, she and I spoke every day. She told me about Miami, about her family. I told her things I never told anyone. Things about George, about the loneliness of a life that looks perfect from the outside and is, on the inside, a series of beautiful empty rooms." She paused. "When Rosa told me she was expecting a child, I was so happy for her. She was going to be the most extraordinary mother. Oh, I was certain of it." The garden shifted below the window, a gust moving through the roses. "George found out," Eleanor said, and her voice changed, flattened, as though she were covering something she did not want to look at directly. He had very specific ideas about what was appropriate and what was not, about the boundaries of what he called the household's professional integrity. The word came out with a bitterness that was clearly not her own. He told Rosa she would have to leave, that a woman in her condition could not continue in her role. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. I argued with him. For the first and almost the only time in our marriage, I argued with him with everything I had. But George was immovable when he had decided something. He believed he was being generous. He gave her a month's severance. He called it compassionate. Elena looked down at her own hands. "She left on a Thursday morning," Eleanor said. "She didn't make a scene. She didn't ask for anything. She just packed her bag with that same quiet dignity she brought to everything. And before she walked out, she came to find me, and she gave me a hug, and she said, Eleanor stopped. Her jaw worked silently for a moment. She said, "Don't let him make you smaller, Eleanor. You are bigger than this house." The old woman's voice broke very slightly on the last word. I have thought about that sentence nearly every day for 33 years. The room was so quiet that Elena could hear the distant sound of the clock in the foyer, the same patient ticking that had been the only sound in the house when Daniel came through the door the night before. "I tried to find her," Eleanor said, "in the years after, when I had a little more freedom, when the children were older, and I had some room to move. I hired someone to look. But Rosa had gone back to Miami, and she had made herself very small and very difficult to find, in the way that people do when they have been hurt by the world and need to protect what little they have left." A pause. "I sent money. Every year. For as long as I was able to manage it without George's knowledge. I don't know if she received it." Elena looked up. "She did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She never told me where it came from. She said it was from a friend. She used it for my school supplies every September." A long breath. "One every single September." Eleanor reached out and took Elena's hand, the same gesture Elena had made the night before, holding the old woman's hand while she slept, and held it between both of her own thin, trembling ones. "You were supposed to have so much more than this," Eleanor said, and the grief in her voice was ancient and specific and entirely without self-pity. "Your mother deserved so much more than what this family's pride took from her." Elena carried the weight of that conversation through the rest of the afternoon in silence. She carried it while she folded the laundry. She carried it while she prepared the service cart for the evening. She carried it in the elevator, in the corridors, in the small, private geography of her own chest, where it sat like a stone that was also, somehow, a key. On what she did not anticipate was Renata. She should have, perhaps. She had noticed, in the way that people trained by necessity to notice things, notice everything, that Renata had been watching her more closely since the morning in the study, following the geometry of her movements through the house with a gaze that was not casual, asking Claudia questions about Elena's schedule, her access to different rooms, the specific tasks she had been assigned in the East Wing. What Elena did not know, what she would not learn until much later, was that Renata had been in this house long enough to have found things. Letters, specifically. A bundle of them, discovered 2 years ago in the back of a locked drawer in George Hargrove's desk, when Renata, newly engaged, and already calculating the contours of her position in the Hargrove estate, and I had done a thorough inventory of what the house contained. She had read enough to understand that there was a woman named Rosa, that Eleanor had maintained a correspondence, secret, sustained, decades long, with someone connected to this woman, that there was a child somewhere whose existence, if it became known to Daniel, would complicate things considerably. Not legally, not financially necessarily, but emotionally, in the way that complicated emotional truths have a habit of redistributing power in a household, of rearranging loyalties, of making a man look at the woman beside him and wonder how well he truly knows her. Renata had replaced the letters and said nothing. She had simply carried the knowledge like a small, private weapon, available if she ever needed it. When she heard Elena say the name Rosa in the study that morning, she understood that her window was closing. She went to Daniel that evening, after dinner, with a carefully composed expression of reluctant concern. "I didn't want to say this in front of her," Renata began, settling onto the edge of the sofa in Daniel's sitting room. "But I've been concerned about Elena's behavior in the East Wing for some time now." Daniel looked up from the papers he had been staring at without reading for the past hour. "What behavior?" "She spends far more time in your mother's room than her duties require. I've noticed it for weeks." Renata paused, and Claudia mentioned that some of the items on the credenza in the sitting room had been moved this afternoon. The photographs. Daniel was very still. "I think she's looking for something," Renata said. "I think she came here knowing exactly whose house this was. And I think the name she mentioned this morning was not something she simply heard from your mother. I think she brought it with her." She looked at him with an expression of careful sympathy. "I think she may have been sent." Daniel said nothing for a long moment. His face was unreadable in the particular way that faces become unreadable when too many things are happening beneath the surface at once. "I want her gone," Renata said, "before this goes any further." "You want a lot of things," Daniel said quietly, and something in his tone, some new quality in it, made Renata pause. "Daniel, I'll handle it," he said. But the way he said it did not sound like agreement. That night, long after the house had gone quiet and Mrs. Lawson's light had gone out, Daniel Hargrove went to his father's desk. He had avoided this desk for 8 years. He ran his company from a sleek, modern office in the financial district. He signed contracts on a glass table with a panoramic view of the harbor. This desk, this dark, heavy mahogany monument to his father's way of doing things, he had kept closed, the way you keep a room closed when the person who lived in it is gone, and the grief of opening it still outweighs the practical necessity. He sat down and opened the bottom drawer. He was not sure what he was looking for. He told himself he was simply looking. The way a man looks when a name has pulled a thread he cannot stop himself from following. What he found was a bundle of letters, bound with a piece of faded ribbon, tucked beneath a leather portfolio he had never opened. He undid the ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was his mother's, the elegant, looping script she had used before the illness had made writing difficult. The letters were addressed to no one, which meant they were drafts, unsent, or sent and returned. He opened the first one. "My dearest Rosa," it began. He read for a very long time. By the time he set the last letter down on the desk, the clock in the foyer had moved well past midnight, and the room around him had taken on the specific quality of a space in which something irreversible has just occurred. He sat with his father's letters in a pool of lamplight, and he understood, fully, finally, without the shelter of not knowing, the exact nature of the debt his family carried. He understood something else, too. The woman sleeping in the small staff room at the end of the east corridor, the woman who had sat beside his mother in the dark and held her hand until she was no longer afraid, was not here by accident. She was here because the world, which had taken so much from her, had nevertheless guided her feet to the one door behind which the truth of her mother's life was finally waiting to be found. And he had almost closed that door himself. He sat at his father's desk until the first gray light of morning began to seep beneath the study curtains. And then he stood, straightened the letters into a careful pile, and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. Not for himself. For two. Elena found him in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, standing at the counter with 2 cups of coffee already poured, his back to the door, his posture carrying something she had not seen in him before, a heaviness that was not exhaustion, but the specific weight of a man who has been forced to see himself clearly and did not entirely like what he found there. He heard her come in and turned. He looked as though he had not slept at all, and he did not pretend otherwise. "Sit down," he said. Not a command this time, something closer to a request. She sat. He set one of the cups in front of her and sat across the table. The same kitchen table where the household staff took their meals, the table he had never once sat at in the 6 months she had been in his house. She noticed this. She said nothing about it. He placed the bundle of letters between them. Elena looked at his mother's handwriting on the envelopes, and she felt the tightening in her throat that she had been managing for 2 days. Carefully, methodically, the way you manage a fire you cannot afford to let consume you. "My father dismissed your mother 33 years ago," Daniel said. His voice was level and deliberate, the voice of a man choosing honesty over comfort with the same discipline he brought to everything else. He did it without decency, and without consideration for what it would cost her. And my mother, he paused, his jaw tightening briefly, spent the rest of his lifetime and her own trying to make it right in the only ways available to her. He looked at Elena directly. "You deserve to know all of this, from the beginning. I am sorry that you are sitting in my kitchen learning it now, as a woman of 31. From letters you should have received years ago." Elena looked at the coffee cup in front of her. She thought about her mother, about Rosa making breakfast in the Miami apartment with the same quiet efficiency Elena now brought to other people's kitchens. She thought about the September mornings when new school supplies appeared without explanation, and Rosa said only that a friend had been generous, and Elena had not thought to press further because children accept the small miracles of their lives without receipts. She looked up at Daniel. She never blamed anyone, Elena said. She never said a single bitter word about this family. She just kept going, the way she always kept going. Daniel absorbed this in silence. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that your answer changes nothing about what I intend to do next." Elena waited. "Did you know? When you applied for this position, did you know this was the Hargrove house?" "No," she said simply. "I knew my mother had worked for a family in Charleston. I didn't know the name. I found out when I saw your father's portrait in the entrance hall on my 3rd day." A pause. "I recognized him from an old photograph my mother kept. She never told me who he was. She just kept the picture. I think," Elena stopped, composed herself, continued. "I think she kept it because of your mother, not because of him." Something in Daniel's face shifted, a grief moving through it like weather, and then settled into a resolve that was quiet and absolute. "I found out about Renata this morning as well," he said. "She knew. She found letters 2 years ago and chose to say nothing. And last night, she tried to have you removed before the truth could reach me." He said it plainly, without drama, in the way that people state facts they have accepted and are done being angry about. "She will be leaving today." Elena did not say she was sorry to hear it. She was not, and she would not insult either of them by pretending. They sat together in the morning quiet of the kitchen while the house came slowly to life around them. The distant sound of Mrs. Lawson's footsteps in the east wing, the first birds outside the window, the grandfather clock marking the hour with its patient, unchanging voice. "My mother asked about you this morning," Daniel said, "before I came down. Mrs. Lawson said she woke early, and then the first thing she said was Elena's name." He looked at her across the table. "Not Rosa. Your name." Elena felt the tears arrive then, not dramatically, not with any collapse of the composure she had maintained across 2 days that had asked everything of her, but quietly, the way her mother had always said the truest feelings come. A single line of warmth down one cheek, acknowledged and then set aside. "I would like you to stay," Daniel said. "Not as staff. I won't insult you with a title or a salary discussion this morning. I want you to stay as—" He paused, and for the first time in their acquaintance, she saw him genuinely searching for words rather than selecting them from a prepared inventory. "As the person my mother recognizes when she looks at your face, as someone who belongs in this house in a way that has nothing to do with a contract." He looked down at the letters. "My father took your mother's place in this family from her. I would like to stop carrying that as a debt and start correcting it as a fact." Elena was quiet for a long moment. She thought of Sophia, who needed stability and a city with good schools. She thought of her mother, who had given her the earrings with no explanation, and perhaps with every explanation. She thought of Eleanor upstairs in the East Wing, waking with her name on her lips, the name of Rosa's daughter, the child she had sent September money for, the small life she had tried to reach across 33 years of silence and regret. "I'll stay," Elena said. "But I have a daughter. She comes with me." "Of course," Daniel said, and without a moment's hesitation. Elena picked up her coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the garden, where the last of the autumn roses were still holding their color against the cooling morning air. Stubborn and dignified, the way her mother had always said beautiful things are when they are rooted in something real. Upstairs, in the room at the end of the East Wing, Eleanor Hargrove sat by her window in the early light, her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the garden with an expression that was, for the first time in years, entirely peaceful. She did not always know what day it was, or what year. She did not always know the names of the people who moved through the rooms of her house. But this morning she knew one thing with the complete and unshakable clarity that sometimes visited her like a gift. So Rosa's daughter was still here, and that, after 33 years, was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.